Conceptualization can be considered one of the most significant traps in the process of spiritual awakening, or in the attempt to contract back into pure awareness. And this is why. Conceptualization creates the illusion of knowing, a belief or type of self-deception. While conceptualization is the mind's ability to label, categorize, and create narratives, it can trick individuals into believing that they know or have realized something, when in reality they are engaged with a mental construct rather than direct experience. In spiritual awakening, this manifests as an attachment to ideas about awakening or beliefs about the nature of reality, rather than resting in the unfiltered awareness that transcends conceptual thought and observes all that is directly. Conceptualization reinforces the ego, as it often is tied to the mind's need to organize the world around a central I. Even when discussing non-duality or spiritual truths, the act of conceptualizing can subtly re-establish the sense of a separate self, that is, that there is an individual there to understand or achieve something. In the following piece, I would like to do a deep dive on the understanding of conceptualization, how to recognize it and prevent its improper use from causing corruption and separation. And so first, the word conceptualization and its origins. The etymology of the word conceptualization traces back primarily to Latin roots, though there are parallels in ancient Greek philosophy that provide contextual insight into its development. The word concept derives from the Latin conceptus, meaning something conceived, but also from concepere, to take in or to grasp. The term implies both intellectual apprehension and creative formation. I want to emphasize the dualistic facet of this word so we can keep this in mind for later, as it is often a very important oversight in spiritual stages that thwart one's advanced progress. The English word concept entered the language in the 16th century, referring to an abstract idea or general notion. The Greek term synlepsis means grasping together or comprehension. It reflects a similar act of mentally seizing or forming an idea. The notion of fantasia, which means imagination, and dianoia, which means reasoned thought, resonates with the process implied by conceptualization, which means abstracting and organizing thoughts in the mind. The reason that I've added the Greek is because of the vastly expanded vocabulary that the ancient language possessed, and conceptualization appeared as a result of the very development of language in our species. The larger the vocabulary the culture had, the greater and more expanded its awareness and understanding of reality was. Nothing more true can be said of the ancient Greeks, whose vocabulary was around 500,000 words, which was particularly extensive for the time. It reflects its cultural and philosophical richness. Most modern, albeit distorted, spiritual philosophies or religions around the world would have originally derived from the gnosis held by the ancient Greek mystery schools, who took particular care to meticulously attach meaning to their words to correspond with their deep and profound insights. Conceptualization itself is a natural part of your human organism's survival that is tied to its cognitive development and evolution. The very ability to conceptualize is deeply intertwined with the development of language, enabling humans to communicate and share experiences effectively, to reason beyond immediate experiences. Initially, language evolved to point out immediate needs, like food danger and safety. This ties to evolutionary psychology, where language enhanced cooperation and survival through shared understanding. It also gave us the ability to encode complex experiences by transforming direct perception into shared stories. These stories allow humans to organize and preserve knowledge. It's a way that we abstract from our experiences to create a simplified and understandable map of reality. In psychology, concepts form mental frameworks that help us organize information, make predictions, and navigate complexity. For example, the concept of a tree helps us categorize objects with similar characteristics. For example, things with a trunk, branches, and leaves. Anything with these characteristics that we come across would be categorized in our minds as a tree and recognized as a tree. Cognitive psychology studies how raw perceptual data, for example, sights and sounds, are processed into abstract ideas. The brain simplifies and categorizes sensory input, turning infinite details into finite, manageable concepts. If our range of perception didn't filter out the full range of the electromagnetic spectrum, we would not be able to process all of the details and be unable to function or survive. We are operating naturally in a reduced, filtered, and limited state of mind. And for the most part, our concepts are meant to reflect that. In cognitive science, there's a focus on the limits of conceptualization. For example, biases arrive when our minds filter reality incorrectly, leading to stereotypes or misconceptions. As with the example of the tree, this generalization of characteristics doesn't give the mind the tools to deal with any expansion on characteristics or variation, or even similarity. Even if a thing has all the characteristics of a tree, it may not be a tree, and also if the thing has so many variations it cannot be recognized as a tree, when in fact it is a tree. Nuance is required to understand the full reality which cannot be grasped by a concept. If the concept is taken as truth, the actual reality of the thing may be dismissed incorrectly. Direct experience is not just vital for awakening, it's vital for direct contact with reality and truth. Anything else is a form of conceptualization, including this audio file, and the information that I'm communicating to you. While it is possible to have your own realization from information that you take from my communication, for the most part, what you will get is a conceptualized abstraction or imagined comparison that in no way can equate to the direct experience or realization of the thing itself that I am pointing towards or trying to communicate. That is why it is vital to carry out the practices of spiritual teachings and not just to listen to them as a passing fancy or accumulation of information or knowledge. That is not enough to awaken. In fact, it may deepen your delusion, leading to spiritual bypassing and the formation of a spiritual ego. Conceptualization simply refers to the process of organizing sensory input into abstract thoughts and ideas. That is, what you see, hear, smell, touch, and taste, that are filtered from your experience into simplified ideas or language that you can then communicate to others. The problem is that reality is so infinitely complex that it can often be difficult to capture and communicate an experience effectively. It is a way that we abstract from our experiences to create a simplified and understandable map of reality. And there are many forms that this can take besides stories. One of these examples would be mathematics. Math is a man-made concept used to measure and describe reality, which is a type of narrative. It is not a thing, it has no substance, it doesn't exist in its own right within our physical reality. It only exists as a mental construct, a concept, as a mapping tool used to describe and communicate reality. Maps are purely conceptual and descriptive. They can be attached to things by way of description or meaning, but they are not the things themselves. They are the measure of those things, describing those things, but in no way encompass the totality of reality of those things. They only point to them. The things themselves, reality itself, can only be known through direct experience. Experience is known as the field of qualia, where measurement is the field of quanta. There is a phrase used in the study of philosophy to emphasize the importance to distinguish between conceptualization and reality, and that is that the map is not the territory. Eastern spiritual philosophies like Zen also contain a similar phrase. The finger pointing to the moon is not the moon. It can guide you to the thing, but it is not the thing itself. This is fairly straightforward and can seem silly to think that a person would mistake a pointing finger for the moon, or a map for the land as though it was the actual land. But people do this all the time when the beliefs and ideas that they hold are mistaken for the thing itself. Even worse still, some of those beliefs and ideas are completely false and don't point to anything, as they are complete mental fabrications. A person can claim to know or have realised or had insight into something, but be completely deluded if they don't gain their understanding from actually experiencing the thing itself from the first person perspective. Reading about, learning about, thinking or contemplating something, or even hearing about it from someone else doesn't bring someone understanding, knowing, or wisdom. It is what is called an epistemological issue. Epistemology being the manner in which we acquire our knowledge and how it forms our worldview, or indeed concepts of the world. Conceptualization, while essential for organizing sensory input and sharing knowledge, creates an inherent distance from reality. It maps reality but is not reality itself. As concepts are passed down, through language, teaching, or storytelling, they lose their richness, depth, and connection to direct experience. This process can be likened to a game of Chinese whispers, where each retelling introduces distortions and omissions, not just because of the way that it is told is changed, but that the receiving persons have no direct experience or true understanding of what they are being told. What begins as wisdom gained from direct engagement often degrades into rigid belief or dogma when severed from its original source. This degradation projects a kind of conceptual matrix over reality, not a physical grid imposed by external forces as some of the spiritual community believe, but an internal projection of the mind. This matrix is formed through conditioning, both individual and collective, as a cultural and societal framework that shapes how we conceptualize the world. It becomes a veil that overlays reality, creating a facsimile, a degraded copy of the infinite complexity of what truly is. Instead of just observing what is or directly experiencing the world, we think about it and mistake the thoughts for direct experience. The majority of knowledge we individually hold about the world and reality are actually nothing more than beliefs, a lot of which are unfounded and held onto because they support our own agenda, biases, and survival, be that the survival of our identity or ego, or our actual survival. For the truth seeker, one of the first veils to dissolve is the conceptual matrix. It is the recognition that much of what we perceive as the world is not external reality, but an imagined construct within the mind. This construct, built from inherited assumptions, biases, and abstractions, creates a kind of blindness, a trap where we mistake the map for the territory, and it is we ourselves that are projecting it onto the world. The following are a couple of examples that will make this more clear. Consider an engineer who builds an engine. Through trial, error, and deep engagement, they develop a finely balanced, fully functional system. Their process is a creative act of discovery, involving intricate understanding of physics, mathematics, and design. When the engineer teaches a mechanic how to repair the engine, they pass on only the necessary knowledge to maintain or replace the parts. The mechanic, while proficient in practical repairs, lacks the full understanding of the engineering principles. This simplification continues when the mechanic explains the engine to a driver. The driver will learn a watered-down version, enough to maintain oil, coolant, and filters, but not enough to truly understand the engine's complexity. Each step down the chain reduces the depth of knowledge, leaving the original creative process fragmented and diluted. This illustrates how conceptualization degrades over time, Without direct experience of the creation process, each successive interpretation becomes increasingly detached from the original understanding. What began as a profound act of creation turns into a simplified map of reality, useful but incomplete. The driver never directly engaged in the creative process and will never know how to create and build an engine. He would only be able to do this if he actually went through the process of designing and creating. Also consider the student learning about the Grand Canyon in geography class. They study photos, read about its formation, and hear detailed descriptions of its vastness and beauty. Over time, they form a mental image, a conceptualization of what the Grand Canyon is. Then one day, the class visits the canyon in person. As the teacher asks, "What do you think?" the student responds, "It's not how I imagined it." This simple statement reveals the inherent limitation of conceptualization. The student thought that they knew the Grand Canyon based on the information from class, but this knowledge was merely an abstraction, a mental map created by the mind. Only through direct experience, standing at the canyon's edge, feeling its scale, and seeing its colours shift in the sunlight, does the student encounter the reality of the Grand Canyon, beyond the limits of their prior imagination. This example shows the importance of the education system in learning and gaining foundational understanding of our world, but also shows a serious limitation in that a student who only acquires knowledge from their predecessors may not go on to integrate this knowledge into a direct experience where they gain wisdom and gnosis. It is seen time and again when students of university study a subject but then fail to get a job as they lack any experience. The information that they have learned may or may not be accurate. Their understanding of it may or may not be accurate. And they do not know whether it is because they never took part in the creative or inquisitive process that led to the formation of that knowledge, like the inventor, the scientist, or experimenter who created it. They have also not put it to the test through practical use and have never verified it for themselves. This experience of putting the knowledge or information into practical use is vital for understanding and wisdom. Like an engine, you can learn about it in theory, but until you take it apart, see how it works and put it back together again, or better yet, design and build one yourself, your education is incomplete. Another example. Consider a devout follower of religion who claims to know God, based on their scripture and teachings. They quote sacred texts, attend rituals, and passionately argue that their religion holds the absolute truth. Yet the very act of seeking, through prayer, worship, or proselytization, betrays their lack of direct experience. If they truly knew God, their search would end. They would no longer need to cling to dogmas or defend their beliefs. Instead, their knowledge is a conceptualization, a second-hand interpretation of spiritual texts and traditions. The scriptures themselves are not direct experience of God, but symbolic pointers, attempting to describe the indescribable. Taking these pointers literally creates an illusion of knowing, trapping the follower in a cycle of belief and separation from the reality that they seek. This example highlights how literal interpretation of spiritual texts can become a barrier to true realization. Genuine spiritual experience transcends conceptualization, revealing God not as a thing to be understood, but as the infinite essence that cannot be captured in words or beliefs. It is a realization or an experience beyond definition. Similar patterns of belief, formed through misinterpreting second-hand information, are seen in cults, conspiracy theories, and nationalist pride, amongst others. These belief systems often distort or omit inconvenient truths, failing to grasp the complexity and nuance of reality. Instead, they create narrow, rigid worldviews that frequently lead to suffering, disconnection, and corruption. Imagine someone who visits a single city in a foreign country and forms a definitive opinion about the entire nation based on that one experience. They might say, "This country is dirty and chaotic," or "Everyone here is so unfriendly," based solely on their brief interactions in one location. This sweeping generalization ignores the vast diversity of cities, cultures, and people within that country. Their limited experience, filtered through personal biases and preferences, becomes a fixed belief that shapes how they speak of the nation and influences others who may accept their opinions without question. This type of thinking spreads narrow and often negative views, creating division and prejudice. In philosophy, this is known as the fallacy of generalization, a logical flaw where conclusions are drawn from insufficient evidence. Often these conclusions arise from emotional reactions to isolated experiences. When emotions cloud judgment, they impair the ability to think critically or reflect on the biases that shaped the conclusion. Without questioning the origin of their thoughts or the mental filters through which they interpret reality, a person's perception becomes distorted and disconnected from the truth, ultimately corrupting their behaviour towards others, like labelling them, criticising them, or making comments that have no factual basis. This clearly shows how the concepts a person holds as truth amplifies their biases, reinforcing extreme dualities, and create fragmentation within individuals and societies. A bias forms when conceptualization simplifies reality into fixed categories and narratives. These generalizations act as cognitive shortcuts, biases that shape how we perceive and interact with the world. Stereotypes about people, cultures, or groups are born from these conceptual generalizations, reducing individuals to fixed characteristics based on race, gender, nationality, or ideology, just to name a few. This bias can even apply to oneself, creating inherent limitations about who or what we believe we can be. Accepted narratives and societal expectations impose these constraints, reinforcing the idea that we must conform to them. But what happens when we come into direct contact with reality? When we encounter something or someone that doesn't fit into these narrow categories? What happens when reality challenges our conceptual beliefs? Our biases often trigger cognitive dissonance, a mental discomfort that arises when our deeply held beliefs clash with new evidence. In response, we may bury our heads in the sand, make excuses, or dismiss the new information entirely. This refusal to confront the truth is an attempt to justify holding on to outdated ideas and maintaining the ego's fragile sense of identity. There's no greater indication of this than a person who reacts in an angry and defensive manner. As I have said many times, trace disharmonious emotions back to the very thoughts that preceded them, and you will always find a biased, corrupted, and distorted process of thought. This tendency towards extremes and polarization, often referred to as extreme dualities in spiritual or metaphysical studies, is a direct result of the mind's need to frame the world in binary terms, like good versus evil, right versus wrong, or us versus them. This oversimplification erases the subtle nuances of reality and fuels polarizing ideologies. It is known as duality or black and white thinking, a mental trap where the mind's narrow concept of reality sees only its own perspective as valid, claiming exclusive ownership over truth, against everything else which it deems to be false. This is despite the fact that what they deem to be false also is present and it exists in their experience. They are totally blind to it. Conceptual frameworks around politics or morality frequently divide people into opposing camps, each claiming to hold the truth. These rigid views lead to conflict, reinforcing separation rather than fostering understanding. Conceptualization divides the world into isolated pieces, creating the illusion that individuals, groups, and nations are fundamentally separate. This fragmentation undermines unity, fuels tribalism, and perpetuates disconnection from the larger reality of oneness. When conceptual maps are taken as absolute truths, they harden into dogmatic beliefs that resist questioning or revision. This stifles creativity, adaptability, and progress, locking individuals and societies into outdated or harmful systems. As people cling to distorted or polarized views, society becomes increasingly fragmented, leading to collective suffering through conflict, inequality, and disconnection from the interconnected fabric of existence. The attempt to preserve these views at all costs through lying, manipulation, or even self-deception breeds corruption, eroding trust, and further entrenching division. However, this preservation behaviour is not fundamentally created by society or governance. It arises within individuals who fail to examine their own thinking and understanding of how their minds work. Each individual contributes to the collective through the quality of their own mind and perspective, feeding into the larger system with their biases, beliefs, and behaviour. People like this continue to blame their external circumstances instead of taking responsibility or even stopping to realise that they are creating it from their own minds. When individuals fail to recognise these patterns within themselves, the collective becomes a magnified reflection of their own inner fragmentation. Understanding this flaw is the first step to return to unity. One way to recognise how this flaw operates is by questioning your own perspective. For example, imagine you're sitting in a room with a friend who is doing something that provokes you to feel intensely annoyed. A third person enters the room and you express that the friend is being annoying. However, the third person isn't annoyed and doesn't perceive the friend as annoying. This highlights an important truth. The friend is not inherently annoying. The annoyance exists within you. It is your internal state that is causing the reaction, not something external. From your perspective, it seems as though the problem is outside of you, but when viewed through the lens of multiple perspectives, it becomes clear that the source of the annoyance is within. This realization reveals a deeper layer. Your state of annoyance is rooted in a bias, and that bias stems from something that conditioned your mind prior to that moment. It could be something from days, years, or even as far back as childhood. At some point you formed a concept that people who behave like this are annoying. In truth, this reaction is not caused by the person in front of you, but by your own conditioning, or lack of personal awareness. Recognizing this conditioning is key to the understanding of how your own mind shapes your reality and how these distortions create unnecessary separation, conflict, and suffering for you, and it is all self-induced. This leads to a personal statement that I often make when people claim that there must be only one truth. Reality is not one way. It is all ways simultaneously. The belief that there is a singular, absolute truth arises from the mind's need to simplify and categorize. But reality in its essence is infinitely complex and multifaceted. Every perspective, every experience, and every interpretation holds a fragment of truth. What we perceive as truth is often just a reflection of our own conditioning, filtered through the unique lens of our individual minds. When we insist on one singular truth, we deny the richness and diversity of existence. We fall into the trap of dualistic thinking, dividing the world into right and wrong, true and false, based on our limited conceptual framework. Yet reality is vast enough to encompass all perspectives, contradictions, and variations simultaneously. It is only through the dissolution of our biases and the expansion of our awareness that we can begin to glimpse this infinite wholeness and the richness and diversity of existence. Just as conceptualization creates bias and division in society, it can trap spiritual seekers in false understanding, clinging to ideas about awakening or enlightenment rather than experiencing it directly. Having explored the nature of duality and the traps of conceptualization, we now turn to the spiritual practices that dissolve these illusions and lead to the realization of non-duality. In spiritual terms, duality is the perception of separation, the belief that there is a me and a you, a right and a wrong, or self and other. It's the root of division, conflict, and suffering. Concepts are tools of the egoic or material mind that veil the non-dual nature of existence. Enlightenment involves transcending conceptualization to experience pure awareness. And so I would like to introduce a practice. Find a comfortable position and place your hand in front of you. Look at it and examine it. It's familiar. You know what it is, what it does, how it came to be there. Now put your hand behind your back and out of sight. Think about your hand, imagine your hand, look at it and examine it in your mind's eye. It's still familiar, you know what it is, what it does, how it works. In your mind, you are thinking, hand. This is my hand. It's attached to me. Its purpose is for doing this and doing that. It looks a certain way. It's as though there's something actually there. Now put your actual hand in front of you again, only this time, don't think. Silence your mind, silence your thoughts, and just observe this thing that is before you. Look at it, examine it, but don't think. Now put your hand behind you and out of sight again, and do what you did before. Think about your hand. Think about the image you see when you think about your hand. Think about the very fact the word hand pops into your mind when you actually look at a hand or think about it. Think about and notice the narrative and story that is attached to it. That you call it my hand as if it is you. Now put your actual hand in front of you and look at it without thinking again. By repeatedly shifting between thinking about and simply observing the hand, you deconstruct the conditioned mind's automatic tendencies to label, identify, and project meaning onto reality. This may take some time, days, weeks, even years before a realization occurs. As conceptualization is a thought, and recognizing when thinking is happening, you can cease this leading to an unfiltered direct experience of a something in awareness where you don't even know what a hand is. It is just an appearance in awareness with no meaning, and this can eventually result in a mystical experience of seeing the object as an aspect of interconnected consciousness or God, a dissolving of the self, so to speak. By observing the hand and recognizing the mental activity of labeling, you become aware of how conceptualization creates a narrative overlay onto direct experience. Like a veil, a matrix, or a grid map, metaphorically speaking, of course. Shifting to simple observation bypasses this narrative, revealing the raw appearance of the hand in awareness. This type of practice mirrors key principles found in contemplative traditions like Vipassana, where perception becomes unfiltered. The word Vipassana means clear seeing or clear vision, when you are encouraged not to think but simply observe, like observing your breath. When conceptualization falls away, the mind no longer fragments reality into this and that. The hand, like all things, is seen as an expression of the infinite. This is akin to the insight of Advaita, or non-duality. There is no separation between the observer and the observed. The sense of I dissolves into the realization that the observer is not a separate entity, but awareness itself. This is the transcendence of ego and the direct experience of unity. The hand is no longer just a hand, it is both formless and form, a dynamic aspect of the infinite consciousness manifesting in the present moment. What you are being guided to do is to separate your conceptualization of this thing which appears in front of you from your direct experience of the thing that appears in front of you. It is not that easy to do in the beginning, because the second you look at your hand, you think, hand, and every attached meaning that you have ever been exposed to floods in. The entire story about it automatically arises in your mind. A story that your mind has been conditioned with. So when I say conditioned, I could also use the words programmed, taught, imprinted, but this does not indicate that someone intentionally did this to you. It is an inherent part of your culture derived from language and communication that's part of the evolutionary process, and you are in just one stage of it. It is completely normal for a species to go through this until they reach the next stage of becoming construct aware and then actualized. When you go through the deconstruction process of any facet of reality or infinity, you end up with raw, unfiltered non-duality or oneness. Patterns arising out of one consciousness for a time and then re-emerging with it. But here's the catch. With conceptualization itself, there is a duality. Within the experience of reality itself, there is a duality. Our experience is that of a dualistic world, where we make choices between things in order to learn and grow. If you remember where I said at the beginning, that the term conceptualization implies both intellectual apprehension and creative formation, I want to emphasize the dualistic facet of this word, as it is often a very important oversight in spiritual stages that thwart one's advanced progress. Many spiritual paths focus on negating or dissolving the mind's destructive tendencies, for example, illusions, biases, and conditioning. While this is necessary for clearing distortions, it risks reinforcing the belief that the mind is wholly bad. By focusing solely on the mind's destructive aspects, one may fail to recognize its creative role in manifesting and exploring reality. The goal of spiritual practice is not to reject duality, but to see through it, to make it transparent, to transcend the illusion of separation, and realize that all is one, to understand the purpose of the entire creation. This is not a conceptual understanding, but a direct experience, a shift in perception where the boundaries between self and other dissolve, revealing the underlying unity of existence. Staying in the state of cessation is not conducive to life and can lead a person to get stuck in a phase of nihilism, where nothing has any meaning or substance and their life has no purpose. A lot of spiritual seekers do not pay attention to the advanced teachings beyond these deconstruction realizations, where the duality is understood and integrated back into their life, to create preferences from which to experience purpose and meaning. The difference on the way back into life is that the preference is consciously chosen and not programmed or unconsciously conditioned as a reaction. The person is not at the mercy of what is happening, but is creating the thoughts from which they feel and act. Conceptualization is not just a limiting filter that constrains thinking if not questioned, but can be an adaptive tool that helps us to navigate the world. It's not only about categorization, but also creativity. Divergent thinking explores how we break from traditional thinking to form new concepts, and this progresses us as individuals and collectives. It reflects both the intellectual act of grasping and the generative process of conceiving reality. It reflects both the intellectual act of grasping and the generative process of conceiving reality. It can be seen as a divine or creative act that bridges the infinite and the finite. It was once said that our minds create the world, but first the world creates our minds. We start by being conditioned before we deconstruct our own processes to become self-aware, and eventually we reprogram ourselves to live creatively. One is being at the whim of the external experience or perception of external circumstances, and the other is responsibility for the process being created from within. Creative conceptualization is a divine, imaginative process that mirrors the act of creation itself. It brings forth something new, integrates direct experience, and operates in alignment with reality. Deceptive conceptualization, on the other hand, is a fragmented, derivative process that substitutes beliefs for understanding. It amplifies bias and duality, creating illusions and perpetuating separation. This distinction is critical in spirituality and brings attention to the two uses of the mind. That is, the mind as a tool can either illuminate truth through direct experience, or it can obscure it through conditioning and distortion. Recognizing when conceptualization serves or deceives is essential to spiritual growth. True creativity arises only when one transcends conceptual filters, rooting their actions in direct experience and pure awareness. This echoes Zen teachings, where creativity flows effortlessly from a mind free of delusion. When conceptualization is purified, it no longer divides reality but reflects it as a harmonious whole. Concepts become tools to express the infinite variations of the one, rather than a mechanism of separation. Difference and variety is celebrated rather than demonized. Creative versus destructive potential. Conceptualization can manifest as a creative force, bringing ideas into form and generating meaning, or as a destructive trap, dividing and distorting reality into limiting beliefs. There are spectral degrees of separation. The mind operates along a spectrum, from total unity, which is oneness, to extreme separation, which is duality. Each mental act, thought, definition, or judgment fractures the whole to varying degrees. This fracturing is not inherently bad, but is part of the infinite unfolding of consciousness. By recognizing the mind's dual nature, one can navigate it with discernment, avoiding the trap of rejecting it outright as bad, while also not becoming ensnared by its deceptions. To access truth, one must first unravel the conditioning imposed by language, culture, and beliefs. This is the process of wiping the slate cleaning and dismantling false narratives, pretty much all of them. Realization arises only when concepts are seen as pointers, not absolutes. Spirituality demands direct lived experience, not second-hand beliefs. Only when the mind is silent, free from the noise of deceptive conceptualization, can genuine creativity emerge from within. This creativity aligns with the divine act of creation, flowing from pure awareness, flowing from source. There are infinite degrees of creativity and destruction. This infinite range reflects the mind's capacity to explore all possibilities within consciousness, from unity, which is constructive and integrative, to fragmentation, which is divisive and delusive. Conceptualization, and indeed the entire mind, is an aspect of awareness, but not awareness itself. It is a tool of exploration but cannot encapsulate or define the totality of awareness. Here are two philosophical parallels. In Kashmir Shaivism, this dual spectrum is described through spanda, which is the creative vibration of consciousness that oscillates between unity and diversity. In Advaita Vedanta, this mirrors the tension between the illusory play of Maya, which is the appearance of separation, and Brahman, which is the absolute oneness. Awareness is beyond words. Oneness, being total and infinite, defies definition. Any attempt to describe it fractures it into finite forms, creating a facsimile rather than the thing itself. While definitions divide, they also serve as pointers to deeper truths. The challenge lies in recognizing that words are tools, not realities, and that they can point towards oneness without capturing it. Awareness emerges as the unchanging anchor beyond the dualistic oscillations of the mind. Awareness observes the mind's creative and destructive tendencies without being affected by them. It is the ground of being, within which all mental activity unfolds. The goal is not to reject the mind or its functions, but to integrate them without identifying with them. This allows one to use conceptualization as a creative tool without being trapped in its distortions. Some key practices that you can take on. Witnessing the mind. Regular meditation or mindfulness can help one observe the dual nature of the mind without reacting to it. Then there's discerning illusion from truth. That is, recognizing when conceptualization serves awareness or creativity, and when it veils awareness destructively. Another practice is creative alignment, and that is using the mind consciously to express unity, beauty, and truth, rather than perpetuating fragmentation. As an extension of divine consciousness, the mind mirrors the infinite play of creation and dissolution. It explores every possibility within existence, from harmony to chaos. While the mind oscillates within this play, awareness remains untouched, silent, formless, and whole. This perspective aligns with the idea that consciousness is the dance of duality and infinite possibilities, and awareness is the stillness from which this dance arises and to which it returns. Awareness being the silence and the stillness between everything. Conceptualization is neither wholly good nor bad. It's a tool with both creative and destructive potentials. The mind operates along a spectrum of unity and separation, reflecting the infinite play of consciousness. Spiritual growth involves navigating this spectrum, recognizing the mind's traps while integrating its creative potential. Awareness as the ground of being transcends and includes all dualities, offering the perspective to see the mind for what it is, a part of the whole, but not the whole itself. This balanced understanding invokes both reverence for the mind's role and detachment from its illusions. I decided to do a deep dive into the nature of conceptualization, but even this exercise was just a conceptualization. The beauty and irony of such deep dives is that they inevitably loop back into themselves and become paradoxical. They are conceptualizing the nature of conceptualization. It's like trying to observe your own eye without a mirror, or tasting your tongue with your tongue. The process is brilliant because it brings clarity, yet it's also inherently limited by the very tool that you're examining. It's also symbolically represented by the Ouroboros, the serpent that loops back onto itself, eternally eating its own tail. This realization is, in itself, a profound insight. Conceptualization is a tool, not the thing itself. The act of diving in shows how the mind operates, but it also reminds us of the simplicity and immediacy of awareness beyond all concepts. Take a moment to savor the humor and lightness of that realization, because that is where the seriousness of philosophy dissolves into the playfulness of being, where the mind stops and life can begin.